June 4, 1942. A windless morning over the North Pacific. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier Huryu cut through gray swells like a blade, 150 miles northwest of Midway Atoll. Inside the ready room, Lieutenant Mio Kobayashi's hand trembled as he traced coordinates on his map. The numbers didn't make sense. Through the porthole, Admiral Taman Yamaguchi leaned over a reconnaissance photograph with an expression colder than fear. Not anger, not confusion, but the quiet realization that their perfect arithmetic had just snapped in half. "Impossible," someone whispered. The grainy black and white image on the table was unmistakable, an American aircraft carrier, Yorktown class. The same ship Kobayashi had seen engulfed in flames weeks earlier in the Coral Sea. The same ship Tokyo had declared dead. And yet, there she was, launching planes into the sky. 3 carriers, not 2. In every wargame, every briefing, victory had been a foregone conclusion. 4 Japanese carriers crushing 2 damaged American ones. But this single photograph meant their flawless equation had acquired a fatal third variable. Yamaguchi didn't shout. He didn't have to. The room was already electric with panic. Japanese doctrine was built on certainty, intel so exact that strategy became ritual, but rituals don't survive surprises. On paper, the Americans were supposed to be broken. 1 carrier sunk at Coral Sea, another under repair, a fleet limping toward irrelevance. Tokyo's intelligence reports left no room for ghosts. Yet Yorktown had returned, and with her, 80 more aircraft and the crushing weight of industrial resilience the Japanese still underestimated. Kobayashi's throat tightened. He could hear the noise of the ship around him change, radios sputtering, boots hammering the decks, clipped orders cascading through corridors. The neat, elegant strike plan, the one rehearsed for months, was already unraveling before the first bomb fell. 3 carriers meant their ambush had become a duel. 3 carriers meant their advantage had narrowed to the width of a torpedo wake. And 3 carriers meant they were fighting a nation capable of doing the impossible fast. Japanese naval planning had always assumed time was their ally. A carrier struck with a 550-pound bomb, decks punched through, tanks ruptured, it should have been in the dockyard for months. That was how the Imperial Navy itself operated. Perfection first, combat readiness later. But across the ocean, another philosophy was at work. Function over form. The Americans didn't wait for beauty. They patched, welded, sealed, and sailed. To Kobayashi, this was unthinkable. To the Americans, it was Tuesday. He thought back to the Coral Sea report, Yorktown trailing oil, dead in the water. Japanese pilots radioing triumph. Intelligence officers removing her name from every operational table. The Emperor himself informed. She was gone. She had to be gone. Yet outside, somewhere over the horizon, Yorktown's dauntless dive bombers were climbing toward attack altitude. What Japanese planners had calculated as a 2-front engagement had just turned into a 3-front storm. In the carrier's operations center, senior officers stared at updated reconnaissance data. 3 American carriers confirmed, an aide said flatly. 3, Yamaguchi repeated almost gently. No one moved. The sound of the ocean outside seemed unnaturally loud, waves slapping steel like the ticking of a clock. Their entire operation, Operation MI, was built on one assumption, that Yorktown would not be there. And now she was, a phantom rising from the Pacific. Admiral Nagumo aboard Akagi had just received the same news. His face, usually serene, was carved with something close to disbelief. They had 4 carriers, yes, but the battle plan was tuned like a violin for 2 opponents. Every sortie, every torpedo, every reserve aircraft was calculated for that ratio. Change the math, and the symphony collapses into noise. At 10:52 a.m., the Imperial Navy's greatest advantage began to erode, not with a battle but with a photograph. Intelligence hadn't failed in a small way. It had failed catastrophically. Across the fleet, operations officers recalculated sortie schedules. fuel, ordnance, fighter coverage, all built for a perfect equation that no longer existed. Kobayashi watched as pencil lines on maps were erased and redrawn, again and again, as if the act could somehow change the sea itself. For the first time, the Japanese fleet wasn't advancing toward a scripted victory. It was walking into the unknown. In that unknown, Yorktown waited, scarred, hastily repaired, but very much alive. She wasn't beautiful anymore. She was ugly steel, welded scars, and stubborn will, but she could fight, and that was enough. On the flight deck of Huryu, Kobayashi climbed the ladder toward the open air, the wind snapping at his flight suit. He squinted into the horizon, where low clouds were gathering like a curtain about to rise. Somewhere behind that curtain, 3 American carriers moved in silence. They weren't supposed to be here. He didn't say it aloud. Everyone already knew. Every man aboard felt the same silent chill. They weren't fighting just ships. They were fighting something they couldn't fully measure, a nation capable of pulling a warship from death's grip in days. Back in Tokyo, strategists would later argue about intelligence failures, about miscalculated repair rates, about luck. But here, in this moment, Yamaguchi understood the truth first. "They changed the game," he murmured. The war had taught the Japanese to fear American numbers. What it hadn't taught them, until this hour, was to fear American speed. A ship they had written off was now pointing its bow straight at them. At 11:00 a.m., the first waves of aircraft were already screaming skyward. The Battle of Midway had begun not with bombs but with disbelief. And disbelief was already enough to tip the balance. May 8, 1942. Coral Sea. Rain squalls drifted across a bruised horizon as Japanese dive bombers sliced through the clouds like hawks. Below them, the American carrier Yorktown emerged from mist and rain, her flight deck slick with seawater, her aircraft still being spotted for launch. Lieutenant Commander Kakuichi Takahashi led the strike, squinting down through the rushing air, locking onto the gray silhouette below. He banked hard into his dive, the engine screaming as the world narrowed to a single target. A 250-kilogram bomb dropped free, streaking toward Yorktown's island structure. The explosion tore through 5 decks, punching open compartments like a fist through paper. Flames surged upward in a red bloom, smoke roared skyward, and the ship staggered like a wounded animal. From 10,000 feet, Japanese pilots watched her slow listing, trailing oil across the dark sea. Over the radios came clipped voices, steady and certain. "Target destroyed. Carrier finished." Photographs captured the smoke columns and the limp trail of oil like a funeral ribbon stretching across the Pacific. To the pilots above, Yorktown was already a corpse drifting toward the bottom. Japanese intelligence moved quickly. Reports declared the carrier sunk. Tokyo celebrated another step toward uncontested dominance of the Pacific. By the time the photographs reached the Imperial General Staff, Yorktown's name was already crossed off the American order of battle. But inside that burning ship, Captain Elliot Buckmaster was not preparing to die. Below decks, damage control teams staggered through smoke-filled passageways. Seawater poured into ruptured compartments, flames clawed upward through twisted metal, and the air reeked of burning fuel. Buckmaster's voice cut through the chaos over the intercom. "Keep her alive. We're not done yet." Yorktown's men didn't have the luxury of procedure. Pumps were improvised from whatever still worked. Engineers scavenged parts from machinery meant for other purposes. Bulkheads were shored up with whatever they could find. Ugly, fast, and reckless repairs began as the ship fought not to sink. Observers in the Japanese fleet saw her drop to 6 knots, wounded and limping. But below deck, boilers were coming back online. The engine room roared like a beating heart forced to keep going. By nightfall, Yorktown was making 20 knots. She wasn't dying. She was escaping. The crew's race to save her was brutal. 66 men lay dead, and the ship bore a whole 5 decks deep. Elevator machinery was wrecked, compartments flooded, The smell of fuel hung heavy in every corridor. But every hand aboard understood something simple. If Yorktown went down, America's Pacific line would snap. And so they worked as though the war itself depended on their hands. For 3,000 miles, Yorktown limped toward Pearl Harbor. Waves pounded the patched hull. Pumps ran without rest. Repair crews rotated in exhausted shifts. Sleep was something men stole in corners for a few minutes at a time. Across the ocean, Japanese intelligence intercepted coded American transmissions reporting her position. They calculated with their own standards that a damaged carrier could make only 5 to 8 knots. Their conclusion was simple. Even if Yorktown somehow survived, she could never reach Pearl Harbor in time for Midway. In their equations, the ghost they had left behind in Coral Sea was already buried beneath the waves. On May 27th, she appeared on the horizon off Oahu, trailing an oil slick 10 miles long, listing to port. Her flight deck was scarred black. Smoke curled upward from temporary welds. Admiral Aubrey Fitch, who inspected the ship upon arrival, saw what should have been a wreck. 90 days, he thought. That's what it would take to make her fight again. 90 days America did not have. But Pearl Harbor in 1942 was no ordinary naval yard. After the attack 5 months earlier, the entire base had transformed into something unprecedented, a place where the impossible was an expectation. Salvage crews had raised sunken battleships from the mud of December 7th. Now, those same hands stared at Yorktown and saw not ruin, but a challenge. Admiral Chester Nimitz stepped onto the dock as the ship was still settling into position. Oil clung to the water around his boots. He looked over the scarred deck, the scorched steel, the gaping wound punched through her hull. This was not a ship that should return to battle. This was a ship that should have been buried at sea. He turned to the men who would decide her fate, Yard Superintendent Claude Gillette and Hull Repair Officer H.J. Finstad. His voice was quiet but absolute. 3 days, he said. We need her in 3 days. No one laughed. No one argued. In that moment, everyone understood. This wasn't just about one carrier. This was about the Pacific itself. Yorktown had been struck down, but she hadn't sunk. She crawled across the ocean, wounded but unbroken, to land at a dock where thousands of hands were waiting. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Japanese fleet believed she was gone. In 3 days, they would learn how wrong they were. May 28, 1942. Dawn bled over Pearl Harbor as welders lit their torches and the first sparks cascaded against Yorktown's scarred hull. The air smelled of oil, hot metal, and urgency. The ship that should have spent months in dry dock was about to be reborn in less time than it normally took to repair a tugboat. 3 days, 72 hours. That was all they had. Beneath the surface of the naval yard, Station Hypo had already deciphered the Japanese plans. Commanders knew the enemy's target, Midway, and the exact day of the attack. They also knew the Imperial Navy expected to face only 2 American carriers. Yorktown's reappearance would tilt the balance from desperate defense to a fighting chance, but only if she could sail. At the dock, more than 1,400 men poured aboard the crippled ship. They came from every trade: welders, electricians, carpenters, machinists, pipefitters, riggers. Many hadn't even been told the full situation. They didn't need to be. Orders were simple: get her back to sea. 3 days, no excuses. The work began before the dry dock had fully drained. Men sloshed through ankle-deep water, sparks flying over their boots as they crawled under beams and over twisted steel. What should have been a carefully planned repair was closer to organized chaos. Decisions were made on the fly. Blueprints were ignored. If something could be welded, it was welded. If something couldn't, they found a way around it. The bomb had blown through 5 decks. Normally, Japanese naval architects would have demanded each layer be cut out and rebuilt to exact tolerances. Pearl Harbor's solution was blunt: weld thick steel plates over the damage. Make it strong enough to take a hit, not pretty enough to impress an inspector. Wooden beams from construction sites were dragged in to brace weakened frames. Fuel tanks too mangled for quick repairs were sealed off entirely. Electricians dragged miles of cable through passageways, stringing them over decks instead of threading them through bulkheads. Power distribution was crude, exposed, and dangerous. But it worked. In 3 days, this patchwork would keep the elevators and weapons systems alive long enough to fight. Boiler crews faced their own impossible task. 3 boiler rooms had been damaged. Superheater systems were gone, limiting top speed. There wasn't time to rebuild anything. Instead, they bypassed what they couldn't fix, patched what they could, and accepted that Yorktown would sail slower than before. It didn't matter. She only needed to be fast enough to fight. As night fell, welding arcs lit the dock like a second sunrise. Workers moved without sleep. Men leaned against bulkheads for 10-minute naps and went back to hammering steel. Cafeterias sent food down in buckets. When electricity from the welding drained Oahu's grid, the city went dark without protest. Civilians knew what was happening. No one complained. There was no ceremony here, no speeches, no brass bands. Just sweat, noise, and the belief that this mattered more than anything else. A young electrician named Lewis Walters would later say, "We didn't fix her the right way. We fixed her the fast way. Every cable we ran, we pictured some kid up there needing it to work." Inside the ship, the heat grew unbearable. Patches dripped with condensation from welding torches. Fuel tanks sweated fumes. The whole hull seemed to groan like a living thing trying to breathe again. On deck, supervisors barked out orders with chalk-stained hands, marking what was done, what wasn't, and what would have to be ignored. There was no perfection here, only urgency. Meanwhile, a few hundred yards away, codebreakers in Station Hypo stared at decrypted messages. Every hour confirmed it. The Japanese carriers were coming. 4 against what they believed to be 2. They had no idea that a third was being welded back together in real time. Admiral Nimitz walked the dock that night. He didn't inspect from a distance. He climbed ladders, ran his hand over fresh welds, leaned close to patched seams still warm to the touch. Oil stained his boots and hands. To the men working below decks, his quiet presence mattered more than any speech. If he believed this impossible task could be done, then it would be. By the second day, the numbers were staggering. 20 tons of steel welded in place, 35 miles of electrical cable, 400 tons of contaminated fuel pumped out and replaced, 3 compartments sealed off completely. It was the kind of rapid industrial work the Japanese Navy didn't believe was possible. There were no permits, no layers of approval, no committees. Supervisors authorized changes on the spot. If a beam needed cutting, someone cut it. If a patch needed welding, someone welded it. It was fast, messy, and absolute. On the third night, exhaustion set in hard. Men worked with blackened hands, burns across their arms, eyes ringed with sleeplessness. But no one left. They ate where they worked, slept where they fell, and got back up to finish what they'd started. A hull technician later said, "We weren't just fixing a ship. We were trying to change the outcome of a battle none of us would fight." By dawn on May 30th, the final welds cooled in the morning air. Yorktown sat upright, no longer listing. Her scarred deck still bore the marks of Coral Sea, but beneath the damage was something new, brute strength. She wasn't restored. She was reforged. The shipyard whistles blew, not as celebration but as a signal. Repairs were done. She was leaving. Many of the workers who had spent 3 days crawling through her wounds stepped back from the dock in silence, sweat still streaking their faces. They had pulled a warship back from the grave in 72 hours. On the flight deck, air crews began preparing borrowed planes from Saratoga, Enterprise, and scattered squadrons. She wasn't returning as she had left. She was patched together from fragments of other ships, other men, other missions. But she was alive, and she could fight. Beyond the horizon, the Japanese fleet still believed she was gone. In a few days, they would learn what 3 days of American grit could do. May 30th, 1942. Morning light spread across Pearl Harbor as Yorktown's engines rumbled to life. She slid away from the pier slowly, almost silently, escorted by tugboats that guided her past the scars of December's attack. The air still smelled faintly of welding and oil, and the patches along her hull gleamed dull silver in the sun. Shipyard workers crowded the docks, their faces streaked with exhaustion and pride. Many had spent 72 hours inside that ship, working without rest. Now they stood shoulder to shoulder as she moved toward the open sea, too tired to cheer, but unwilling to look away. The carrier that should have been at the bottom of the Coral Sea was headed back to war. Yorktown's air group was a patchwork, pulled from wherever the Navy could find experienced hands. Bombing Squadron 3 from Saratoga, Torpedo Squadron 3, assembled from survivors of other ships. Pilots from 3 different squadrons who had never flown together before lined the deck. There was no time to train as a unit. There was only time to fight. As she cleared the harbor, men on the dock raised their helmets in silent salute. Chief Hull Technician Finstead, who had overseen the brutal welding marathon, later said, "We sent her out looking like a fighter patched up between rounds. She wasn't pretty, but she could still throw punches." 3 days later, Yorktown reached the rendezvous point known as Point Luck, 325 miles northeast of Midway. There she joined Enterprise and Hornet. The other crews expected to see a wreck limping in, maybe as reserve. Instead, they watched as she arrived fully operational, launching aircraft and running flight operations as if she had never been hit. Commander Wade McCluskey of Enterprise remembered the moment clearly. "Grown men cheered," he said. "We thought she was done, and there she was." Yorktown's return changed more than the numbers on a strategic map. It changed the mood. Until that moment, every man in the Pacific Fleet had felt the weight of inevitability. Japan had the numbers, the initiative, the upper hand. But the arrival of a ship everyone believed dead felt like defiance made real. It was a message. The Americans weren't done. Far across the sea, on the decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Huryu, Admiral Nagumo's task force advanced with supreme confidence. 4 carriers, 248 aircraft, veteran pilots fresh off months of victories. Every plan, every line of attack had been calculated on the assumption that only 2 American carriers would stand in their way. It was an equation they believed they could not lose. Captain Minoru Genda, Nagumo's brilliant air operations officer, had rehearsed every scenario. Even if the Americans achieved some measure of surprise, numerical superiority and pilot skill would crush them. Intelligence was clear. Yorktown was gone. The Imperial Navy trusted its math. But the math was about to betray them. June 4th. Pre-dawn darkness settled over the Pacific like a heavy curtain. On the Japanese flagship, orders were crisp and confident. At 4:30 a.m., 108 aircraft thundered off the decks of the 4 carriers, their engines echoing across the calm sea. Their mission: destroy Midway's airfields and lure the American carriers into the open. On Yorktown's bridge, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher leaned over the plotting table, watching the chessboard unfold. Intelligence from Station Hypo had given the Americans something the Japanese didn't expect: knowledge. They knew the date. They knew the approximate position. They weren't reacting. They were waiting. The air was heavy and windless as lookouts scanned the horizon. There was no chatter on the bridge, just the sound of ventilation fans and the soft, steady creak of steel. Yorktown had been held together with sweat and steel plates, and everyone aboard knew it. But if she could hold long enough, she could help change everything. Just after 7:00 a.m., the first Japanese scout plane spotted the American fleet. "Enemy carrier sighted," came the transmission. 1 carrier. Nagumo gave the expected order: rearm the reserve aircraft with torpedoes to destroy the enemy ships once they revealed themselves. His plan was unfolding exactly as he imagined. Minutes later, another scout reported what should have been impossible: 2 carriers. A ripple of confusion spread through the Japanese fleet. A second carrier hadn't been part of the equation, but the numbers still favored Japan. 4 against 2 was still certain victory. The wind picked up as the sun rose. The water was calm, the air unnaturally clear. A perfect day for a battle that would decide the fate of the Pacific. Fletcher's staff moved with quiet efficiency. There was no room for dramatics. Every pilot, gunner, and deck crewman knew the odds. They had 3 carriers against 4, but unlike their opponents, they also had surprise. Nagumo couldn't know it, but the seeds of chaos were already sprouting inside his carefully timed operation. The American carriers weren't reacting to his trap, they were springing their own. By 7:15, the Japanese reserve aircraft were in the middle of rearming when another scout plane, delayed by cloud cover, finally reported what no one on Nagumo's bridge wanted to hear. 3 carriers. 3. For a moment, silence hung over the Japanese flagship. The calculation wasn't supposed to allow for this. A 3rd carrier meant the Americans weren't limping to the battlefield. They were coming to fight. On Yorktown, pilots strapped into their dauntless dive bombers and Devastator torpedo planes. The patched flight deck vibrated beneath their boots. They could still smell the steel and welding smoke from Pearl Harbor. Every man aboard knew this ship wasn't meant to be here, but she was, and that knowledge burned hotter than fear. Fletcher's voice over the radio was calm, almost unnervingly so. "We hold the line here." The roar of engines filled the morning. The ship creaked as aircraft began launching into the bright sky. For days, Yorktown had been a ghost, an absence in the Japanese equation. Now she was real again, and that fact alone was rewriting the story before the first shot was fired. Far out to sea, bombers and fighters streaked toward Midway. In the distance, the sun flashed against the waves like scattered glass. The battle was no longer theoretical. The storm was coming. Yorktown was headed straight into it. The first wave arrived low over the water like a dark tide. At 8:20 that morning, Hornet's torpedo squadron, 15 Devastators led by John Waldron, charged toward Nagumo's fleet. Their slow planes were outmatched by the agile Japanese Zero fighters waiting above the sea, but Waldron didn't hesitate. He knew exactly what he was flying into. One by one, the Devastators went down in sheets of flame. When it was over, only a single man, Ensign George Gay, floated in the wreckage, watching the Japanese formation from the sea. He would later say he never saw fear on Waldron's face, only determination. That brutal, hopeless attack had done something numbers couldn't measure. The Japanese combat air patrol had been dragged down to sea level. As their fighters swarmed the torpedo planes, the sky above their carriers lay momentarily unguarded. 20 minutes later, Enterprise's torpedo squadron followed, and they too were cut apart by the Zeros. 10 of 14 aircraft destroyed. Not a single torpedo hit. The sea boiled with wreckage and smoke. Then came Yorktown's turn. At 9:15 a.m., Torpedo Squadron 3 roared toward the Japanese fleet. 12 Devastators, their engines straining, lined up on the carriers. Lookouts on the Japanese ships counted the planes and finally understood the truth. The math was broken. 3 American carriers were on the battlefield. Their trap had become someone else. Admiral Yamaguchi's hands tightened on the railing as the alarm bells began to wail across Huryu. For a moment, all of his carefully constructed plans evaporated. This was not the battle they had prepared for. The Devastators flew into the storm of machine gun fire. One after another they were hit, bursting apart over the gray waves. No torpedoes found their mark, but that didn't matter. Their job was never about hits. Their job was about time. And then at 10:22, the sky itself opened. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie, leading Yorktown's bombing squadron, had gotten lost earlier that morning. He'd found his way to the Japanese fleet by following the faint trail of a destroyer's wake. Now, 17 SBD Dauntless dive bombers appeared almost by accident at the exact moment Enterprise's dive bombers reached the same patch of sky. Not by design, by fate. Below them, 4 Japanese carriers sailed in perfect formation, decks crowded with fueled and armed planes being rearmed for a counterstrike. Above them, the sky was empty. Every Zero was chasing ghosts at sea level. The dauntless bombers rolled over and plunged. The sound of wind screamed through the cockpits as they dove at over 200 knots. Pilots squinted against the vibration, adjusting their aim as black bursts of flak bloomed around them. Yorktown's planes went for Soryu. Enterprise's targeted Akagi and Kaga. In 6 minutes, everything changed. 3 Japanese carriers erupted into fire. Soryu took 3 direct hits, her deck becoming a furnace. Akagi was struck in the heart of her hangar. Kaga was hit so hard that her entire flight deck buckled and tore. Fire roared upward as aviation fuel turned each ship into a floating inferno. Within minutes, crews were leaping overboard into the oil-slicked water. The pride of the Imperial Navy burned beneath the rising sun. Yamaguchi stared at the horizon in stunned silence. 3 carriers gone in the span of a single breath. A century of samurai precision and planning undone not by superior numbers, but by a moment of timing too perfect to calculate. But Huryu still floated, and the Japanese weren't done. Yamaguchi made his decision instantly. Even as Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu burned, he turned Huryu into the wind and launched his counterstrike. 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters clawed their way into the sky, headed straight for Yorktown. Yorktown's lookout spotted them just after noon, black dots on the horizon growing larger by the second. General quarters sounded across the ship. Damage control parties stood by. Gunners ran to their stations. Pilots scrambled to intercept. Lieutenant Kobayashi, leading the Japanese formation, raised his binoculars as they neared their target. His breath caught. The carrier below him was Yorktown, the same ship they had watched die at Coral Sea, the same ship their intelligence had erased from every calculation. Yet here she was, steady, launching aircraft defiant. At 12:05 p.m., 3 bombs found her. One detonated near the island. Steam lines ruptured, power flickered, the ship went dead in the water. Smoke poured from her deck. The same eerie stillness settled over the ocean that had followed Coral Sea. Japanese pilots circled, convinced they had finished her again. But below decks, something very different was happening. The Pearl Harbor repairs were holding. The welded plates hadn't buckled. Damage control crews surged forward, sealing ruptures, shoring up bulkheads, flooding compartments to keep her upright. Chief Engineer John Delaney reported calmly through the smoke, "She's hurt, but the fixes are solid. Give us 2 hours." By 1:40 p.m., Yorktown was alive again, making 19 knots, refueling fighters. From the sky, it looked like a different ship entirely. At 2:30 p.m., Huryu's second wave approached. Their leader expected to find a crippled carrier. Instead, he saw Yorktown underway, ready for a fight. Convinced it must be another ship, he reported back. Second carrier sighted. That confusion was critical. While the Japanese tried to make sense of ghosts, American dive bombers were already hunting Huryu. Hours later, Enterprise's aircraft struck back. Huryu, the last Japanese carrier, was hit and burning by 5:00 p.m. 4 carriers down, one still standing. Yorktown had drawn their fire, taken their punches, and given the Americans time to finish the job. She didn't know it then, but she'd already altered the outcome of the Pacific War. She did not die quickly. After the battle, Yorktown lay wounded, still afloat, her patched hull holding longer than anyone expected. On June 6th, a Japanese submarine found her trailing in the Pacific, under tow. 4 torpedoes sliced through the water. 2 slammed into her side. A third tore into the destroyer Hammond as it rushed to protect her. As the smoke cleared, the old carrier rolled onto her beam and slowly slipped beneath the waves. The men watching her go down said it felt like watching a prizefighter collapse after winning the final round. She had done what she was built to do. But the story of Yorktown was never just about the moment she sank. Her true legacy was the impossible 3 days that came before the battle, the way a nation's will had been forged into steel and sent to sea. The Japanese had believed they were fighting a ship. In reality, they were fighting an idea. In the months and years that followed, Japanese officers struggled to understand what had happened at Midway. Their intelligence had been precise. Their calculations had been perfect. 4 carriers against 2 should have been decisive. What they never accounted for was a shipyard's refusal to accept defeat, an admiral willing to risk everything, and workers who treated a shattered hull as a starting point, not an ending. When Lieutenant Commander Tannabe visited Pearl Harbor 2 decades later, he was shown the dry dock where Yorktown had been brought back from the dead. He stood in silence for several minutes. Then he whispered, "Now I understand. We weren't just fighting your fleet. We were fighting your belief that anything can be done if it must be done." Yorktown's repair changed more than a single battle. It reshaped how the Navy thought about war. Before Midway, repairs followed procedure, methodical, elegant, precise. After Yorktown, the doctrine shifted. Function came first. Speed outranked elegance. Anything that could make a ship fight again was enough. That philosophy spread through every corner of American industry. Liberty ships were built in 4 days. Bombers rolled off assembly lines in less than an hour. What began in dry dock number 1 became the backbone of a war effort that overwhelmed its enemies with relentless, practical force. In the years after the war, Admiral Nimitz called those 3 days the most important 72 hours of the Pacific Campaign. Not because of the welding or the steel plates, but because of what it represented. A nation that could mobilize, adapt, and fight faster than anyone expected. For the men who had worked those 72 hours, there were no medals, no parades. Welders, carpenters, pipefitters, and electricians returned to their shops the next day to fix the next ship. But their work echoed across the Pacific. Every carrier that left Pearl Harbor carried their legacy. Every battle fought afterward bore the fingerprints of that repair. Tom Lee, a gunner who fought aboard Yorktown at Midway, met Lewis Walters, the young electrician who had strung cables across her decks during the repair more than 40 years later. "Your wiring saved my life," Lee told him. "When the first bomb hit and power failed, those cables kept my guns alive." Walters didn't know what to say. All he'd done was work. But work in that moment had changed history. In Japan, the shock of Midway lingered long after the flames were out. Admiral Fukudome would later write, "Yorktown taught us that perfection can lose to speed, and precision can lose to will." It wasn't just that the Americans had repaired a carrier. It was that they had done it faster than anyone believed possible. Even in death, Yorktown remained a phantom. Japanese pilots swore they had sunk her twice. Intelligence officers marked her as lost. Yet on June 4th she appeared again, as if risen from the depths, and the psychological blow of that moment echoed through every Japanese briefing that followed. The lessons of Yorktown are still taught today. Damage control doctrine for the modern U.S. Navy begins with one phrase: get her back in the fight. It's not about making her perfect. It's about making her lethal. The spirit of those welders in 1942 still shapes how ships are saved today. At the bottom of the Pacific, Yorktown lies upright, 16,650 feet down, discovered in 1998. The scars of battle are still visible. So are the crude steel patches welded in those frantic days. They don't look heroic. They look improvised, rough, uneven. But they held. Above the dry dock in Pearl Harbor, a small plaque stands. It reads, "Here, in 72 hours, American workers did the impossible." That plaque doesn't mention the roar of the dive bombers or the flash of burning carriers. It doesn't tell of Waldron's sacrifice, of Leslie's perfect dive, or the Japanese shock at the sight of a ship they thought was gone. It speaks of something quieter, simpler, harder: work. That was Yorktown's real secret, not some hidden weapon or lucky break. It was people, ordinary Americans with welding torches, wrenches, and calloused hands, who refused to let her die. The Japanese measured time in months. The Americans measured it in hours. The Japanese prized perfection. The Americans prized victory. And in those 3 days, that difference changed the course of a war. When Japanese pilots saw Yorktown's aircraft darken the sky over their fleet, they weren't just seeing planes. They were witnessing a nation's will turned into steel. Yorktown may have gone down on June 7, 1942, but what she stood for did not sink with her. It would sail on through every ship launched afterward, every battle fought, every torch lit in every shipyard. She became proof that impossible is just a word.